Hey guys, welcome back to another long, sleepy journey through the quiet disasters of human history. Tonight, we'll be floating through fever dreams, coughing fits, and centuries of human misery. So, grab a blanket, pour something warm or something stronger, and let's drift into the calm, contagious embrace of pandemics. Because nothing says sweet dreams quite like smallpox and the bubonic plague. The Prehistoric Cough Club. Pandemics didn't start with airplanes or cruise ships. They started when early humans decided it was a great idea to stop wandering around and start living in clumps. Picture it. You and your prehistoric neighbors sharing a tiny hut, with livestock snoring in the corner, and everyone politely ignoring the fact that no one's invented soap yet. Somewhere in that charming chaos, a microbe goes, "Yeah, this'll do." The first suspected pandemic, if we can even call it that, dates back around 5,000 years. Archaeologists found a mass grave in Sweden called the Tell Bronze Age site. Dozens of people buried together, all likely dead from a mysterious infection. Nobody wrote it down, of course. Writing wasn't exactly trending yet. But the bacteria, Yersinia pestis, yes, the same little monster that would later bring us the Black Death, has been detected in remains that old. So, it turns out the plague has been freeloading off humanity since we figured out farming. Lovely. Egypt and the ancient germ exchange. Fast forward a few thousand years and we hit the Egyptian dynasties, the world's first international tourism hotspot. People, goods, and germs were constantly floating up and down the Nile. The first recorded epidemic comes around 1350 BCE, during the reign of Amenhotep III. Egyptian texts describe a mysterious plague that spread across the land. Was it smallpox, measles, dysentery? Nobody knows. But given the symptoms, fever, rash, and bodies swelling with boils, smallpox seems like a safe bet. Smallpox was basically history's overachiever of misery. It's believed to have wiped out countless ancient populations. The mummies of Ramses V show the telltale pockmarks, meaning even kings weren't safe. Imagine ruling the most powerful empire on Earth and still losing to a microscopic speck. The Plague of Athens, democracy's bad cold. Let's drift over to 430 BCE, ancient Greece, the birthplace of philosophy, politics, and, unfortunately, one of the first recorded pandemic meltdowns. Athens was in the middle of the Peloponnesian War, fighting Sparta. The citizens, thinking what could possibly go wrong, decided to crowd behind their city walls for safety. Thousands of people packed together. Sanitation? Non-existent. Food and water? Questionable. Enter the plague. The disease, possibly typhoid fever, ripped through Athens like wildfire. It killed up to 1/3 of the population, including the city's beloved leader Pericles. Thucydides, who caught it but somehow survived, described people dying so fast that dogs and birds would not touch the corpses. Democracy, meet germs. Roman fever, when empire meets epidemic. By the time the Romans rolled around, plagues had gone mainstream. They had the trade routes, the roads, the armies, basically all the infrastructure you need for a truly global outbreak. The Antonine Plague hit around 165 CE, probably brought back from the east by Roman soldiers. Because what's a victory march without an invisible hitchhiker? The likely culprit, smallpox again. The symptoms included fever, sore throat, diarrhea, and a rash that made people look like burnt bread. Up to 5 million people may have died, including Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself. The philosopher king, the stoic emperor, the keep calm and carry on guy, undone by a virus. Then came the plague of Cyprian a century later, around 250 CE. This one was even worse. People bled from their eyes and mouths, corpses piled up in the streets, and priests ran out of prayers. The Roman Empire was already wobbling. This just gave it a helpful shove toward collapse. There's a saying that empires die from within. In Rome's case, they also died from diarrhea. The Justinian plague, the original Black Death. Let's float gently to the year 541 CE. Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, was ruled by Emperor Justinian I, a man with big dreams and bad luck. He wanted to restore Rome's glory. The universe, however, handed him Yersinia pestis. The plague of Justinian began in Egypt because, apparently, all pandemics like to start there, and spread through the Mediterranean. Constantinople was hit hardest. Reports say up to 10,000 people died per day. The city ran out of burial space, so bodies were dumped into the sea. Justinian himself caught the plague but survived, though his empire never fully did. The plague kept returning for the next 2 centuries, wiping out as much as half of Europe's population. You know it's bad when an emperor famous for massive building projects has to pause to, well, bury everyone. Now, of course, we come to the star of the show, the celebrity pandemic, the medieval nightmare that rebranded death itself, the Black Death. It arrived in Europe in 1347, carried by fleas hitchhiking on rats aboard Genoese ships. And because medieval Europe was essentially one big, unwashed networking event, it spread faster than gossip in a monastery. Within 5 years, it had killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people, roughly 1/3 of Europe's population. The symptoms were charming. High fever, vomiting, black swellings in the armpits and groin, called buboes, and death within days. Medieval doctors naturally had no idea what to do. Some blamed the stars, others blamed bad smells. A few blamed minorities, because, sadly, history loves a scapegoat. Cities shut down, entire families vanished, and religious processions turned into mass graves. And yet, life went on. People still baked bread, married, gossiped, prayed, and complained about taxes. The plague eventually burned itself out, but not before changing everything: feudalism, wages, and even fashion. Those creepy long-nosed plague masks, that's where they came from, though they were about as effective as wearing sunglasses in a thunderstorm. Let's drift forward a bit. Even after the Black Death, the plague didn't retire. It kept touring Europe in encore outbreaks for centuries. It hit London in 1665, killing 100,000 people, about a quarter of the city. Daniel Defoe later wrote about it, noting that people painted red crosses on doors and wrote, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Charming bedtime imagery, I know. But by then, the world was changing. Trade was global, ships were bigger, cities denser, and diseases had front-row seats to civilization. So next time, we'll quietly slip into the later chapters: smallpox's brutal reign, the elegant horror of tuberculosis, and, of course, that 20th century superstar, the Spanish flu. Because nothing says sweet dreams quite like influenza.
Hey guys, welcome back. If you made it through part 1 without catching anything, congratulations. Tonight, we're floating softly through the next few centuries, an age of powdered wigs, dirty streets, and tiny viruses doing world tours. So, lie back, breathe slowly, And let's begin with the overachiever of infectious diseases, the one that practically auditioned to end civilizations. Smallpox, humanity's longest relationship. Smallpox was the Beyoncé of pandemics. Iconic, ubiquitous, deadly, but somehow classy. By the time we reached the early modern era, the 1500s and beyond, smallpox had become everyone's problem. It didn't discriminate. Kings, beggars, soldiers, and toddlers all got their turn. Symptoms began innocently enough: fever, fatigue, back pain. Then came the rash, the blisters, and finally the pitted scars that became smallpox's fashion signature. Survivors were often left blind or disfigured, like walking reminders that nature does not care about your bloodline. Catherine the Great of Russia got vaccinated, which was brave because medicine in the 1700s was about 50% bleeding, 30% prayer, and 20% guesswork. But long before that, smallpox had already made its debut on the global stage, courtesy of European colonialism. When Europeans discovered the Americas, they also kindly shared smallpox with indigenous peoples who had no immunity. Entire civilizations, like the Aztecs and the Inca, collapsed within decades. Hernán Cortés didn't conquer Mexico alone. He had microscopic backup. One Spanish chronicler noted that it was as if a pestilence had struck the land. Villages emptied, priests died mid-prayer, and survivors buried entire families. It was smallpox that made the conquest of the New World horrifically easy. So while history books might talk about guns, steel, and horses, the real MVP of empire was a virus. Variolation and the birth of vaccination. By the 18th century, smallpox was so common that people were desperate for any solution, even the weird ones. Enter variolation, the practice of taking a bit of pus or scrab from a smallpox patient and rubbing it into a healthy person's skin. The idea was that a mild infection would protect you from a deadly one. And yes, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, an English aristocrat who had survived smallpox herself, saw variolation practiced in the Ottoman Empire. She brought it back to London, where society politely panicked at the thought of injecting people with disease. But then came Edward Jenner in 1796, the quiet country doctor who changed everything. He noticed that milkmaids who caught cowpox, a much milder disease, never seemed to get smallpox. So, naturally, he decided to test his theory on an 8-year-old boy, because ethics committees didn't exist yet. It worked. The boy became immune, and the word vaccination, from vacca, Latin for cow, was born. By the 19th century, vaccinations spread worldwide. Napoleon even made it mandatory for his troops. And in 1980, yes, 1980, the World Health Organization finally declared smallpox eradicated. It took thousands of years, but we finally ghosted a virus that had haunted us since the pharaohs. Tuberculosis, the romantic disease. Now, while smallpox was flashy and fast, tuberculosis, or consumption as they called it, was slow, elegant, and disturbingly poetic. It didn't kill in days, it killed in years. People wasted away gracefully, pale, thin, and tragic, perfect material for 19th century art. Writers like Keats, the Bronte sisters, and Anton Chekhov all either had it or wrote about it. Painters depicted the consumptive beauty, wan, delicate, doomed. Society was practically obsessed. Of course, what they were actually romanticizing was a bacterial infection that slowly destroyed the lungs, caused night sweats, fevers, and made people cough up blood. Nothing says Victorian romance like internal hemorrhaging.
TB thrived in cities. Crowded, smoky, damp, and poor. London, Paris, New York all had slums where entire families lived in one room breathing the same infected air. Sanatoriums sprang up in the countryside, promising fresh air and rest. Patients reclined on verandas wrapped in blankets, watching the fog, while politely dying to the sound of birds. Robert Koch discovered the tuberculosis bacterium in 1882, confirming that it wasn't bad morals or weak constitution causing it, just germs. But the cure wouldn't come until antibiotics in the mid-20th century. Even now, TB still exists, quieter, rarer, but not gone. It's the disease that outlived empires and poets alike. Cholera, the Great Waterborne Panic. Now, if tuberculosis was the slow burn, cholera was the jump scare. It came fast, hit hard, and left people dehydrated into oblivion. The disease spread through contaminated water, which in 19th century cities was basically all water. The first cholera pandemic began in India in the early 1800s, then spread along trade routes to Russia, Europe, and the Americas. People didn't understand how it spread. Some blamed miasma, or bad air, which makes sense if your medical degree came from sniffing puddles. Then came Dr. John Snow, the hero of London's 1854 outbreak. No, not that John Snow. This one actually knew something. He mapped cholera cases and traced them to a single water pump on Broad Street. He removed the pump handle and cases dropped almost immediately. That single, quiet act helped prove that disease spreads through water, not air. Cholera forced cities to modernize, building sewers, improving water systems, and washing things occasionally. Progress. The Spanish flu, when the world sneezed in unison. Let's drift gently into the early 20th century. The world was just finishing World War I. Millions dead, cities destroyed, and everyone emotionally exhausted. So naturally, the universe decided to add a pandemic for good measure. The Spanish flu of 1918 wasn't Spanish, by the way. It probably started in Kansas or maybe France. Historians still argue about it. But Spain was neutral in the war, so its press actually reported on the outbreak honestly. Everyone else censored it to keep morale high. Thus, Spanish flu. It infected about 500 million people, a third of the world's population, and killed at least 50 million. Some estimates go higher. What made it terrifying wasn't just the numbers, but the victims. Unlike most flus, which mainly kill the very old or young, the 1918 strain targeted healthy adults, soldiers, nurses, factory workers. Their immune systems went into overdrive, destroying their own lungs. Hospitals overflowed. Coffins ran out. Entire towns shut down. People wore masks, schools closed, and social gatherings were banned. Sound familiar? But there was also quiet resilience. Neighbors helped each other. Nurses worked until they collapsed. And by 1920, the flu simply faded away, like it had burned through its fuel. Scientists eventually realized it was an H1N1 influenza virus, a distant ancestor of modern flu strains, which is comforting in a morbid way. Between pandemics. The pause that wasn't. After the Spanish flu, people thought they'd seen the worst. They hadn't. But the mid-20th century gave humanity a brief, deceptive calm. Vaccines spread, antibiotics worked, doctors wore clean coats and used soap voluntarily. For a while, it seemed like we'd won. Then came polio, HIV, SARS, Ebola, and of course that little cameo in our own century, COVID-19. But we'll float there next time. Because pandemics, like bad habits, never truly end.
Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're gliding softly into the 20th and 21st centuries, the era of vaccines, science, and the comforting illusion that we were finally smarter than germs. Spoiler, the germs were still winning. So close your eyes, breathe in slowly, and picture a hospital corridor lined with metal beds and humming machines. We're starting with a disease that terrified parents for most of the 1900s, polio. Polio, the summer scourge. Polio didn't always make headlines. For centuries, it quietly paralyzed a handful of children each year. But with the rise of modern sanitation, yes, the very thing that was supposed to protect us, outbreaks actually got worse. Here's the twist. Before sanitation, children were exposed to polio very young, often while still protected by maternal antibodies. They caught it, got mild symptoms, and became immune. But once we started cleaning up, washing hands, filtering water, kids weren't exposed early. When they did encounter the virus later, it hit harder. Paralysis, iron lungs, lifelong disability. By the 1940s and 50s, summer meant fear. Public pools closed, movie theaters went dark, and parents kept children indoors. Newspapers printed photos of wards filled with paralyzed patients encased in iron lungs, long coffin-like machines that breathed for them. Franklin D. Roosevelt, yes, the U.S. president, famously caught polio in 1921 at age 39. He spent the rest of his life hiding his paralysis from the public eye, even founding the March of Dimes to fund research. Then, in 1955, came the miracle. Jonas Salk's vaccine. It worked. It was safe. He gave it away freely, refusing to patent it. When asked who owned the patent, he replied, "Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?" That's the kind of line that deserves to be whispered before sleep. The world cheered. Needles went into arms, and cases plummeted. Later, Albert Sabin developed the oral vaccine, easier, cheaper, and mint-flavored. By the 1980s, polio was nearly gone. But nearly isn't gone. As of today, it still lingers in a few corners of the world, clinging stubbornly to life, a ghost of the 20th century's biggest childhood fear. The shadow of a new virus, HIV, and the long silence. Now, let's float into the 1980s. Big hair, neon lights, and a new epidemic creeping quietly beneath it all. At first, doctors noticed strange cases, rare pneumonias, unusual cancers, immune systems collapsing in young men. They called it GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, before realizing it affected far more than one community. The name changed to AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. The cause, a virus called HIV. It spread through blood, sex, and from mother to child. And in the early years, ignorance spread faster than the virus. Stigma, fear, and moral panic dominated headlines. People refused to shake hands, politicians looked away, and funerals multiplied in silence. The 1980s and 1990s became an era of quiet grief. Hospitals filled with patients wasting away, covered in Kaposi's sarcoma lesions, purple marks that told everyone exactly what they were dying of. But amid the despair, communities rose.
Activists, artists, nurses, they demanded research, funding, respect. The LGBTQ+ community, so often vilified, became the backbone of the fight. By the mid-1990s, scientists had developed antiretroviral drugs, not a cure, but a miracle of management. HIV became a chronic condition rather than a death sentence. Now, more than 40 years later, the story continues. Quieter, more hopeful, but still not over. Around 40 million people have died, and another 39 million live with HIV today. Human history, it seems, always leaves one pandemic unfinished. SARS and the 21st century dress rehearsal. Let's move gently to 2003, the year flip phones were cool and masks were, well, not. That spring, a virus emerged in China. It spread to Hong Kong, then to Canada, Singapore, Vietnam. Within weeks, hospitals went into lockdown, flights were canceled, and people began saying quarantine again. This was SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, caused by a new coronavirus. It spread mainly in hospitals, infecting healthcare workers and patients alike. It wasn't as contagious as later viruses, but it was deadly. About 1 in 10 patients died. The world panicked, then adapted. Temperature checks at airports, face masks, hand sanitizer, and within a few months, thanks to swift public health action, the outbreak was contained. SARS vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, but it left a quiet warning. This will happen again. You are not ready. COVID-19. The quiet global pause. And then, in late 2019, that warning came due. A cluster of pneumonia cases in Wuhan, China. No one paid much attention at first, but within weeks, the world began to close. Airports empty, streets silent, cities frozen in stillness. The COVID-19 pandemic had begun. Caused by another coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, it spread with breathtaking efficiency. By the time governments acted, it had already reached everywhere. The irony? The most globalized, technologically advanced civilization in history was brought to its knees by droplets of breath. Over the next 2 years, more than 7 million deaths were recorded, though the real toll is likely higher. Elderly people isolated in care homes, nurses in plastic suits, supermarket shelves emptied of toilet paper for reasons we still don't understand. And yet, amid the fear, something remarkable happened. Science moved faster than ever before. Within a year, vaccines were developed, tested, and distributed using mRNA technology that had quietly been in development for decades. Humanity, for once, kept pace with its own disaster. Of course, misinformation spread just as fast, because if there's one thing we've learned over thousands of years, it's that ignorance is more contagious than any virus. The psychology of pandemics: fear, fatigue, and forgetting. Every pandemic, ancient or modern, follows a similar emotional arc. First comes denial. It's not that bad. Then fear. It's everywhere. Then exhaustion. Can we please just go back to normal? And finally, forgetting. Humans have a remarkable ability to forget the lessons of the last outbreak. The plague of Athens faded into myth. The Black Death became a historical curiosity. The Spanish flu, which killed tens of millions, was barely mentioned in history classes for decades. We move on, rebuild, and tell ourselves it won't happen again, until it does. Pandemics reveal who we are when the lights go out, how we care for each other or don't. They expose our fears, our resilience, and our capacity to adapt. Sometimes they change history. The Black Death ended feudalism. The Spanish flu reshaped medicine. HIV transformed public health and human rights. And COVID-19, it reminded us that even in the age of space travel and smartphones, we're still fragile, soft-bodied mammals sharing air on a small blue planet. The long view, history's quiet rhythm. If you zoom out far enough, pandemics aren't interruptions. They're part of the rhythm. Civilizations rise, trade expands, humans connect, and microbes hitch a ride. Every new empire builds new roads, ports, and ships, and every virus says, "Thanks for the upgrade." The good news, we've gotten better. Cleaner water, safer medicine, global cooperation. The bad news, the microbes are still evolving too. But maybe that's okay. Maybe pandemics are nature's reminder that we're not invincible, that humility is part of survival. So as you drift off tonight, remember, we've survived worse. We'll survive again. History, after all, is just humanity catching its breath, one epidemic at a time.
Hey guys, welcome to the final stretch. Tonight, we're floating through the soft echoes that pandemics leave behind. Not the screaming panic of outbreaks, but the slow, silent reconstruction that always follows. Because once the coughing stops, history doesn't. It just rearranges itself. The rebuilding after the Black Death. When the Black Death finally loosened its grip on Europe around 1353, it left behind a world that didn't quite recognize itself. Whole villages were gone. Fields lay empty. Labor was scarce. And suddenly, peasants realized something revolutionary. They were valuable. Before the plague, Europe ran on feudalism, lords, serfs, and endless unpaid labor. But when half your workforce dies, power shifts. Wages rise. Serfs walk off estates in search of better deals. Landowners panic. Revolts brew. The social order cracked, quietly at first, but from those cracks grew something new. A middle class, the slow dawn of capitalism, even the faint beginnings of individual rights. The church, too, was shaken. It had promised protection, prayer, and divine mercy, and then watched its priests die just like everyone else. Faith didn't vanish, but it became more private, more skeptical. You start to see art filled with skulls, skeletons, and hourglasses, the Danse Macabre. Death, once hidden, now waltzed openly through paintings and poetry. It wasn't despair. It was acceptance. A grim serenity that whispered, "Everything ends, so live gently." The Renaissance, the bloom after the blight. And then something almost paradoxical happened. From that era of pestilence emerged one of the brightest ages in human creativity, the Renaissance. Cities like Florence and Venice, once emptied by plague, began to rebuild. Wealth, redistributed by inheritance and survival, found its way into art. Patronage blossomed. Michelangelo carved marble. Leonardo dissected corpses. People obsessed over anatomy, beauty, and human potential as if to reclaim the body from the horror of decay. Pandemics tend to make people think more deeply about what it means to be alive. When death becomes ordinary, life becomes deliberate. So maybe it's no coincidence that the Renaissance, with its obsession for proportion,
harmony, and rebirth, followed right on the heels of humanity's darkest epidemic. New worlds, new germs. When Europe sailed west in the late 15th century, it didn't just bring explorers, maps, and crosses. It brought diseases that reshaped entire continents. The Columbian Exchange wasn't just about corn, potatoes, and gold. It was smallpox, measles, influenza, invisible conquerors that decimated indigenous populations. Some historians estimate that up to 90% of Native Americans died in the first century after contact. Pandemics didn't just follow empire, they were empire. The germs paved the way for colonization, plantations, and the global networks that defined the modern age. In return, the Americas sent something back: syphilis. A small, unpleasant token of globalization's two-way street. So when we talk about the age of exploration, what we really mean is the age when diseases went international. Faith in the time of sickness. Pandemics always test faith in gods, in governments, in each other. During the Black Death, people marched in self-flagellating processions, begging for divine mercy. In the Spanish flu, priests gave last rites in crowded wards. In HIV's early years, churches often turned their backs, only to be shamed by those who chose compassion over doctrine. Every outbreak asks the same quiet question: who will we care for when we're afraid? Some respond with cruelty, isolation, blame, superstition. Others with courage: doctors, nurses, volunteers who walk straight into contagion, armed only with kindness. There's something deeply human about both reactions. Fear is ancient. So is mercy. Art and memory. Disease leaves fingerprints on culture. Sometimes they're obvious, like the haunting, skeletal art of the late Middle Ages. Sometimes subtle, like the pale, melancholic heroines of 19th-century novels inspired by tuberculosis. When the Spanish flu swept the world in 1918, its influence rippled quietly through literature and film. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Catherine Ann Porter all wrote under its shadow. The obsession with fragility, with lost generations, with fleeting youth. Those weren't just post-war feelings. They were post-pandemic ones. Even modern art bears traces of fear and recovery. HIV inspired entire movements of activism, design, music, and theater. COVID-19 has already filled museums with masks, photos, and empty cityscapes, relics of isolation. It's easy to forget pandemics once the fevers fade, but art remembers what statistics can't. The science of hope. Not every pandemic ends with despair. Some end with discovery. Plague gave birth to public health. Quarantines, sanitation, early data tracking. Smallpox inspired vaccination. Cholera pushed cities to build sewers. HIV accelerated global cooperation and pharmaceutical innovation. COVID-19 fast-tracked vaccine technology that could someday stop cancer or malaria. Each epidemic forces humanity to adapt, to understand itself in microscopic detail. Its evolution just sped up and televised. We never wanted these lessons, but they keep making us smarter. Or at least more prepared. Hopefully. Then there's the forgetting. Always the forgetting. When the worst passes, people rush to live again. Louder, faster, brighter. After the Black Death came carnivals. After the Spanish flu came the roaring 20s. After COVID, well, let's just say airports filled up pretty quickly. We need that denial. It's how species move on. You can't rebuild the city while replaying the sound of coughing in your head. But sometimes it's worth remembering. Not the fear, but the resilience. Every pandemic, no matter how brutal, eventually ends with someone opening a window. Stepping outside. Listening to the world breathe again. The long sleep of history. As you drift now, maybe into sleep, maybe just into thought, imagine the quiet timeline of our species. Tens of thousands of years, countless plagues, and somehow we're still here. Still building, still loving, still learning how fragile we really are. Microbes come and go. Kingdoms rise and fall. But humans, we endure. We write it down. We turn tragedy